Hello, my name is Mike Bell and the name of my talk is From Outrage to Engagement. How can we harness the energy we feel for the present situation which men find themselves in into effective action by engaging with the mainstream? My basic message is that we're doing too much of these things. Too much complaining, too much talking to each other, too much making videos, attending conferences and feeling outraged. We should do these things, but we also need to balance it with making press releases, writing to our MPs, challenging the media, engaging with the parliamentary process, building a huge network of supporters, and perhaps raising funds for an office to do all the things above. Now, I'm much more optimistic than most people about whether or not we can make progress, because I think we are in what you might call a pre-revolutionary situation. Because most people are not feminists, and the majority are just intimidated by a minority, a vocal minority. And most feminists simply absorb their views from the dominant culture. That is, most people express their views not because they hold them particularly, but simply because that's what everybody else thinks and it's what they've been brought up in. If we look at the comments on YouTube or responses to Twitter or whatever, we can see that there is a huge silent majority of people who support the male-friendly view. And people are simply being hoodwinked by myths. So we can say there is a dominant anti-male narrative, and it is supported by anti-male myth. And we know what the main myths are. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. So there's the gender pay gap, there's the idea that masculinity itself is toxic, the myth that the overwhelming majority of domestic abuse victims are female, that being a fatherless child is not damaging to you, etc., etc. There are probably a dozen or 20 major myths which support the anti-male narrative. So here we have that anti-male narrative, not only supported by anti-male myths, but what I suggest is that it's supported by men's inaction. And so a lot of this talk is about why there is so little action by men and what perhaps we can do about it to improve the situation. So what I'm suggesting is that men are colluding in this anti-male narrative. There is a well-known saying, the only thing needed for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. And what I'm suggesting is that the only reason the anti-male narrative prevails is because too many good men are doing nothing, or certainly not enough. So here we have the anti-male narrative supported, as I say, by the myths and by men's inaction. But what if men's inaction turned to action and we could boot out the myths? What I'm suggesting is that the anti-male narrative would collapse. Of course, that diagram suggests it's going to be simple, and I'm not suggesting it is simple, but I suggest that that is the mechanism. Some people think that this problem is all due to some international conspiracy, but I'm suggesting that it's just a cultural phenomenon, and that consequently it's easier to deal with. So this blue oval represents the whole population of the UK, and there are just a small number of radical feminists. There may not even be as many as that, and these people influence the media and government. You see, I've just given them a small amount of overlap, so I'm suggesting that there are only a relatively small number of people in the media and government who are radical feminists. And on the other side, we see that there are a even smaller, very small number of men's issues activists. Now, the problem, of course, comes because the radical feminists have generated a series of myths, and they feed these myths in a constant stream to the media and government, who, of course, absorb the myths because, you know, we're kind people, and if people say they're being oppressed, we tend to sort of be on their side. That's the sort of people human beings are. And they don't realise that they're being fed a series of myths. And what then happens, of course, is the media and government spread the myths and the anti-male narrative into the general population. So what could be done about it? Well, method one is to expand the movement, that is, increase the number of people who become men's issues activists. If we could get a larger number of people, clearly we could start to influence things in our direction. Method number 2 could be to communicate more with the media and government. So what we need to do, even though we're only a small group, if we start to engage with the media and MPs and explain to them that the myths they're being fed are in fact myths, gradually we might change their opinion. Of course, I'm not suggesting it'll happen overnight. But what of course is a complete waste of time is to attack the radicals. There is no evidence anywhere that doing that, other than militarily, has an effect on the radicals. You can't change their mind. If you start to attack them, what they'll do is reaffirm their ideas that men's rights activists are in fact evil people who are out to repress women, which of course is their ideology. So engaging with them in a hostile way is likely to be counterproductive. So what are the main elements of effective campaigning? Well, firstly, I think we should sound like normal people, be informative and helpful. We should expect support and have a positive mindset that we're likely to succeed. We should have clear statements of the issues, well communicated, with references, perhaps well produced videos on YouTube which we can refer to. Nothing too long, nothing too involved, nothing too hateful, just clear. We also need to build a larger network of male-friendly supporters and develop the lines of communications with the key decision makers, the MPs and the journalists, for example, educators too. And we need to relentlessly challenge the mainstream when they show an anti-male narrative. One thing I've noticed since becoming a men's issues activist is that there seems to be considerable misconception about what MPs are like. Most people seem to think that because they are changing the laws and enacting this anti-male narrative, that the MPs themselves are anti-male. But think about the way in which an MP becomes your MP. The very first thing they need to do is get selected by their local party as the candidate. So they need to get the votes from local party members. To do that, they have to say what they, the party members, want to hear. Secondly, they need to get elected. To get elected, they need the votes of the majority of people in their constituency. To do that, they have to say what those electors want to hear, not particularly their own point of view. Consequently, MPs are almost by definition not very ideological. They're also not hugely intelligent and not very knowledgeable about most issues. They have hundreds of different things come up before them in Parliament and individual problems by constituents. There's no way that they are going to know all about them any more than you or I do. But my experience is they are usually willing to listen because they're that sort of people. They are listening to others kind of people, mostly. So when contacting your MP, you should expect the following. So you make the first contact, and I suggest that you keep it simple. Say what you want your MP to do. Don't just have an angry rant. Make one major point, possibly up to 4, but I suggest that you only do one at a time. And if you've got backup data or links, etc., put them at the bottom of the letter so the letter itself is no more than one side of A4. Keep it polite and in a tone which assumes that your MP will agree, because they're so reasonable and so are you. Now, many people get put off by the first response they get if they write to their MP, but it's important to realise what's going on here. You've written to your MP, dear Mr. Bloggs, and you get back a letter signed by Mr. Bloggs, and it gives the impression that this is a reply from your MP, but it isn't. It's almost always from the MP's researcher or caseworker, and it's almost always a copy and paste of standard paragraphs, some of which are prepared by the research department of that particular political party. And it's quite likely that they won't answer your question or claim that they have already done what you asked them to do. So it's really important at this point to know that that's what's happening and to give an appropriate second response. So either email saying, "You didn't answer my question, here is my question again," or call the office, keep it friendly. It's at that point that you might get the answer to the question which you actually put. Now, if you don't, you shouldn't assume that contacting your MP is a failure. For reasons I'll explain in a minute, anything is going to be helpful. It may not get the result you want, but it's part of the process. Secondly, what are journalists like? Well, they're actually not terribly dissimilar from MPs. So mostly they're non-ideological, they're a bit lazy, and they'll print the press release, which looks okay. That's why you see almost the same item in several newspapers and news programs. We'll look at that in more detail in a minute. So send them some stuff. Maybe they'll print your press release. And if they write an article which is biased, challenge it. Again, you may not get a very positive response, but at least they've been thinking about it. So most politicians and journalists are not anti-male. They are victims themselves of the dominant ideology, as are the vast majority of people. So feel sorry for them, not angry. Now I want to address some serious issues which I've encountered since joining the men's issues movement only 3 years ago. Why men do not work together. Every year, hundreds, thousands of men seek help from some organisations who help men with the family court, etc., when they're going through a contested divorce, for instance. And what these organisations report is that very few men who've been helped then go back to be volunteers. Most just go back to their lives. They're grateful, but apparently not willing to help the next man. Why is this? Why do men not work together? Well, one answer from male psychology you might call stoicism. The human race has survived because men are prepared to defend the tribe and the family and the women and the children. If they didn't do that, then the tribe would not have survived. So we have evolved to suppress our feelings to some degree, to endure hardship and actually gain status by doing so. So, when faced with a very severe crisis, men may seek help, but once the crisis has passed, they return to their stoical norms. So, they don't help other men because that means revisiting that painful experience. And we're just not good at that. Second reason why men may not be working together, also from male psychology, is competitiveness. Men have evolved to be competitive, to try and work their way up the male hierarchy, to try to be the alpha male. So perhaps too many of us are so busy trying to move up the men's rights activist hierarchy that we don't realise we're damaging the very thing we're trying to promote. So we should focus on the project, on what is trying to be achieved, not on the person who is actually trying to achieve it. More things about men not working together. Another problem that I've encountered is what you might call fundamentalism. The general version of this is, your approach is not exactly the same as mine, so I won't work with you. For instance, in response to a proposed launch of a shared email newsletter, one of the things that I propose is that unless we have some sort of shared media so that lots and lots of people can hear about the conference or the march or the article or whatever, we will not make progress. So the suggestion here is a shared email newsletter. I've sent out the draft version, and there are items from Group A and Group B. Response from Group A: I don't want anything to do with you as you're not anti-feminist, and I am. That is, the newsletter itself was not overtly anti-feminist, so this group didn't want anything to do with it. However, the draft version did contain an event organised by Group A. So Group B replies, I don't want anything to do with you as you include material from anti-feminist groups and we don't have anything to do with them. Well, isn't this exactly why men's issues are making so little progress? That we're actually fighting each other more than we're fighting the opposition. It's crazy. Then we have active demoralisation. This is quite extraordinary. This is not particular to men's issues activism. It's actually quite common in other organisations too. That is, activities which so reduce the person's self-esteem that they fail to act on the idea they have. Somebody comes along with an idea and other men tell them why they shouldn't do it. So examples, no, that's a waste of time, or no, it's been tried before and it didn't work. Well, why demoralise people? We need to encourage one another and ensure that criticism is constructive. We've tried that myth. It goes something like, there's no point in whatever it is you just proposed, like writing to your MP, the newspaper, have a march, publish a video. It's been tried before and it doesn't work. Well, why do you think it's going to work the first time? No one advertising a new product would expect to sell a lot after the first advert. It takes 3 times before people even notice the product. Multiple exposure before they buy. And the same is true of political ideas. We need to plant the seed, perhaps again and again. We need to water it and wait, and maybe we need to plant the seed again. And there are more ways in which men demoralise activists. One of them is, you should all be doing my project. Now, there are dozens of issues, and some people have one priority. Well, that's great. It's a good idea for people to have different priorities. And then but the trouble is they try to persuade the rest of us to drop what we're doing and help them. Well, I'm sorry, that is an active demoralisation. So don't do it. It's stop what you're doing. It's what you're doing isn't important. It's only a variation on the earlier type of demoralisation. What we should be doing is saying, that's great, I'm busy doing this. I wish you well. If you let me know how you help. The other thing which we need to be very careful of is something which is new in society, and again not especially for the men's issues activists, and that is the use of social media, text, email, written comments to demoralise people. It's so easy to be critical online, and we often say things much more harshly than we would face to face. Receiving such a written message can also be much harder than hearing the criticism in person. You open up your email and somebody sends you something unpleasant, and it actually demoralises me, certainly, for the morning. So I don't do what I was going to be doing. So ask yourself, does the person I've just interacted with go away with more self-confidence and motivation to act, or less? If the answer is less, please don't do it. Another question is, why do so few people know about men's issues, activist groups and individuals? To give you an example, when I was suffering from depression about 3 years ago after various interactions, I was searching for these types of things, and actually I only came upon men's rights activists after a Google search for women not feeling empathy for men, which was something that I felt that I'd experienced from a number of different women. That led me to the Empathy Gap website, and that was my door into the men's issues movement. But that's pretty strange that I couldn't find it other than by that circuitous route. Similarly, there was a speaker at the conference in 2018 who turned to the list of issues which was displayed on a large poster at that conference and asked a similar question. Why didn't I know about all this? He said, I'm the sort of person who's interested in these things, and I didn't know about all this. We need to address this issue. Another example, Split the Difference decided to organise a men's issues march in 2020. And some people criticised them for not contacting other people who had organised earlier marches. Well, the answer is, they didn't find out about these other groups despite an extensive online search. We need to address this issue. Why do so few people know about us? So here's just a couple of suggestions. we need to make sure our websites are friendly and helpful with good layout and links. And we also need to use common keywords, that is, the words that people do search for, and use search engine optimization techniques to make sure people find us when they're looking. Another form of demoralization is the belief that all this is a conspiracy. Perhaps we've had our red pill moment and realised that much of what we'd believed previously about gender issues was wrong, and this has made us more open to other conspiracy theories. Sometimes the conspiracy is less clearly defined, with the conspirators simply referred to as they. So, for example, I've heard when the name of the group got too active, they closed it down. You can tell this because you don't hear from that group now. There's no evidence that they closed it down. Maybe the people just got demoralised or ran out of energy or started a new job or had some change in their life. You can't assume that because people stopped doing something that it was closed back down by some shadowy organisation. And we also need to remember that David beat Goliath. The Berlin Wall fell. A stream gradually wears down the rock, and it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. One variation on conspiracy is that it's a cultural Marxist conspiracy. This is more sophisticated. Now, clearly, victim feminism and Marxism are both victim mentalities. That is, that the Marxists think that the working class are the victims oppressed by the capitalists, and the victim feminists think that women are the victims oppressed by the men. And because victim feminism came after Marxism and is attracted to the very same people, it looks like a Marxist conspiracy. Well, that is, there are shadowy figures in the background who will get you. Now, clearly, some people who've got jobs in the public sector or something like that need to hide their identity because they might lose their job because of the cancel culture and what have you. But it isn't true that there is some dark international conspiracy that's out to get you. There are plenty of anti-male activists, but no evidence of some central committee or some conspiracy central plan. Let's have a look at the Domestic Abuse Bill, which has just gone through the House of Commons and is now about to be considered by the Lords. One of the first things I did was to look at the reporting in the media of the bill when it was published in January 2019. And what I found is that nearly all report it in the same way. So I'm not going to show you very many, but here's the Daily Express report saying that why law risks failing women. And then we've got this in the Telegraph, government's domestic abuse bill doesn't go far enough, together with one of these standard images. They're not even proper images of domestic abuse, they're kind of constructed things to tug at your heartstrings, which suggests that the woman is the victim and she is suffering from male physical violence. Then you've got the Sun, hundreds of vulnerable women and kids at risk due to delay of domestic abuse laws, and again the use of a very similar image. Now the question we have to ask ourselves is, why are all the newspapers, left, right and centre, and news media telling the same story? The only organisation which actually mentioned male victims was the BBC that I could find among at least a dozen reports. Now, so the question is, why do they all write the same thing? Well, of course, it could be a cultural Marxist conspiracy, and that the Central Committee has phoned up the editor and threatened that if they don't report it the correct way, that something nasty is going to happen to them. But remember, journalists are just lazy and busy like the rest of us, and they don't do proper research, but they know what the dominant narrative is, so they just rewrite the press release. And that's why each newspaper and news item looks roughly the same, is because they've all used the same press release. and then they just go to the standard image bank and pull out the standard images because they're lazy. So they all write something similar for that reason, not because it's a cultural Marxist conspiracy. What if we wrote press releases? Maybe they would print them. Is it worth a try? The next thing I did was I looked at the written submissions to the Domestic Abuse Bill Select Committee. What happens in Parliament is that the actual chamber of the House of Commons only has short debates on bills, but the line-by-line process is done on something called the Select Committee. Well, the first thing you notice is that the overwhelming majority of members of that committee were female. So I'm not going to try and address that now, but they did invite written submissions, and I have it on good authority, both from an MP and from somebody in the Home Office, that these submissions are read, at least by the officials, and discussed with the Minister. Obviously not absolutely every little bit of it, but let's have a look at how many submissions there were pro and anti-male. So the male-friendly submissions were 4 in number. One from Mankind, one from Dr. Elizabeth Bates, a researcher up in the northwest, one from Chris Angle, and one from me. But the female-friendly or anti-male submissions were 19, including these people: Women's Resources Centre, South All Black Sisters, University College London, Rights of Women, Prison Reform Trust, Women's Aid, Amnesty International, and 9 more. Most of these organisations were saying very similar things. I think there must have been quite a lot of collaboration, basically saying that domestic abuse was gendered and that it needed to be written as such in the bill, because otherwise women wouldn't get the support they needed. The fact is that women get 99% of the support already. So now we know the reason. We know why the anti-male narrative has developed and grown. It's because too few men are doing too little. If Parliament asks for written submissions and we can't even be bothered to write in, we've only ourselves to blame. So here's some examples of successful engagement. The Men and Boys Coalition wrote in to object to the use of the word overwhelming to describe a proportion of female victims of domestic abuse. They wrote to the Office of Statistics Regulation in the UK Statistics Office. Here you see Dan Bell, Chief Executive, writing to make the complaint. This is the reply from the Statistics Office. What they say is, if you see the highlighted words at the bottom, is that the phrase overwhelming majority is a subjective statement. However, it may imply that a larger proportion of victims are female than the statistics show. That is, it's not very certain, but they have acknowledged that it is at least not a fair use of the word. So not a complete win, but some progress. Then earlier this year, Mankind Initiative challenged the use of the word vast, again to describe the percentage of female victims of domestic abuse. That is, the vast majority of domestic abuse has female victims. So they wrote again to the Office of Statistics Regulation. Here's their reply. So you ask whether the word vast to describe the number of male perpetrators. We agree that the use of the word vast is not an appropriate description of how large the majority actually is. We spoke with the Home Office. The Home Office has said it will remove the word vast from both paragraphs in the guidance to the bill. That is a more significant success. Here's another one, perhaps not quite so important, but well worth mentioning. Belinda Brown noticed that in this calendar offered to schools as a learning resource, November the 19th was down as World Toilet Day, and that International Men's Day was missing from the calendar. So she wrote in quite strongly. There were other days like Armistice Day and Diabetes Day and National Tree Week. She sent in a stern response. International Men's Day was added within 24 hours. There it is, along with World Philosophy Day and World Toilet Day. What if lots of people did this same sort of thing? And what if we created teaching resources and sent them out to every school a month ahead of International Men's Day? Are you saying that that would have no effect whatsoever? I'm suggesting we'd get somewhere, maybe in year 2 or year 3. And here's an example from Philip Tanzer, just an individual person working independently. He noticed that West Mercia domestic abuse strategy, this is a police area up in Scotland, used a gendered approach. So he wrote in, highlighting some positive aspects. This is always a really good idea. Start off with the positive. And then highlighting problematic sections. He got a response from Rebecca Ewins, the commissioning officer, and they had an in-depth phone conversation. She was very supportive and open and promised to make sure that male victims got more recognition. There's an update on that. Philip got this letter just the other day. Your letter has made an impact, and the updated domestic abuse strategy will be published shortly, where you'll be able to see amended areas based on some of your comments. This will be available on the West Mercia's Police and Crime Commissioner's website soon. We are grateful for your input. By being polite and being constructive, Philip made an impact on his own. So this is the result of contacting MPs about the domestic abuse bill. I'm focusing on actions to do with the domestic abuse bill simply because it's been happening over this summer. We contacted several MPs about the domestic abuse bill, or got local constituents to do so on our behalf. And we know of 15 replies from MPs. 1/3 were female focused, that is, they agreed that the overall majority and the whole bill should focus on women. 1/3 were neutral, just got those kind of standard paragraphs back from the researcher or the secretary. But 1/3 were supportive of male victims. And in the debate in the House of Commons, there were 6 people who spoke in favour of male victims. We also noticed that nearly all the male positive people were male themselves and also conservatives. And so here's a list. We can start to build a list of supporters in the Commons. Now, the other thing one can do is phone the MP's office. So again, this was about the scrutiny committee. We found that there was a pro-male statement by a male Conservative MP. So I wrote to thank him and highlight several points that he might make, particularly about the fact that male victims were not covered by the scrutiny committee. And just got a kind of standard response, so I decided to phone the office. Well, I spoke to a caseworker, and when I explained that I was concerned about male victims, her response was, "Oh yes, I'm working on a case like that just at the moment." That is, I did not get a hostile response. She said that she would put my points to the MP, and a few days later I got an email saying that he wanted to speak to me, and we had a half-hour conversation. I mean, he phoned me, and we had a very useful conversation in which I discovered that the government had brought in the whips to make sure that anti-male amendments failed, so that the wording of the bill remains gender neutral. I don't think that's a failure. I don't think that's a hostile response. What if lots of people did similar things? Wouldn't it make a difference? I think it would. But how long will it take? I think sometimes when I hear people say, I wrote to my MP and it didn't have any effect, or people have been doing this and still we see no change. It takes ages to stop or turn a tanker, and even when you're making progress, it will look like a failure. So the tanker carries on in the direction that you don't want it to be up, even though you started to turn the rudder. It takes a long time before you see the effect. Years and years, but it requires persistence. But let's ask whether this cultural change is happening. It takes a long time to stop the tanker. Just because the anti-male narrative continues to win at present, it does not mean that progress is not being made. As I mentioned, there were 6 people who spoke in favour of male victims in the House of Commons debate, not just Philip Davis, as would have been the case only a few years ago. And these are just minor examples, but in the last few months, Philip Tanzer has started Gender Parity UK. Stephen Fitzgerald has started Men and Women Working Together. Will Davies has started the Campaign for Shared Parenting, and Sally Burris has started Split the Difference. All spontaneous, independent initiatives which share an inclusive and non-confrontational approach to the problem. And we're trying to draw these people together under the umbrella of Gender Parity UK. Not to stop them doing what they're doing, but so that we can work together and help each other. Well, if it's true that male psychology tells us that men won't campaign for themselves, maybe men would fund an office. What if someone was scanning the press for bias and writing in every time? What if 400 MPs received messages from constituents on a particular issue or a vote? What if someone was challenging organisations on the facts that they displayed on their website or publications? What if we had really good informative or even entertaining videos explaining the issues and the myths? If we can raise the funds for an office like this, we may be able to do all this on a regular basis. So let's have a look at some of the things that need to be done. We do need some sort of shared media, some sort of email or newsletter or Twitter feed or something which allows large numbers of supporters to be reached in a way that they will read and act. And here's an initiative. It's called the Equalogist, a monthly newsletter aimed at gender parity in the UK, with information, events, myths, books, videos, articles, websites, etc. Just a small bit about them, telling you what lots of different people are doing on men's issues. So you might like to sign up for that. Then what if we had a Parliament Watch? So we have people monitoring Parliament and identifying the relevant bills and debates. What if we developed a list of MP links? Well, this is something we're working on. Get several hundred people who agree to write to their MP when we send the material. So we just are creating a spreadsheet with this information on it, the constituency and the MP name and the name of the person in the constituency and their email. So we can say, please write to your MP about this bill or this issue. And maybe lots of MPs will get a bit of information, and over time we may be able to achieve some change. And what about media watch and response, monitoring key phrases in newspapers? This can be done on a Google search, TV news, etc., and responding to anti-male bias. So if we see totally biased things like this, we respond. We may not win immediately, but let's do it. And what if a newspaper received dozens of complaints when they published a biased report? Would they carry on reporting like that? So what I'm suggesting is that here we have the anti-male narrative, supported by anti-male myths, and also supported by men's inaction. But what if men's inaction is replaced by men's action, and men's action boots out the myths? Then I would suggest the anti-male narrative collapses. Okay, that sounds simplistic, but I think it's optimistic. So let's move from outrage to engagement. Let's do less complaining, less talking to each other. Maybe make a few less videos. Maybe you don't focus on attending conferences. And let's not feel outraged, let's feel empowered. Let's make press releases. Let's write to our MPs. Let's challenge the media. Let's engage in the parliamentary process. Let's build a network, and let's raise funds for an office. Let's engage with the system and it. Let's transform outrage into engagement. Thank you.